Mesechus Yevamos Daf Nona test discusses the halachos of the marriages of a Kohen Gadol, who a Kohen Gadol is allowed to marry, and some particulars of that halacha. The Gemara will begin with that topic as it relates to our last Mishnah. The Gemara is going to have a question on that subject and try to prove it from our last Mishnah. Then the Gemara will quote a Mishnah. We'll have our next Mishnah, which introduces the topic, which we've already started, and it'll give us the basic halachos of the Kohen Gadol, who he's allowed to marry and who he's not. The Gemara will go through a number of shilas as to what types of biyas and relationships invalidate a woman to the marriage of a Kohen Gadol. So let's begin with an introduction. The Torah tells us that a Kohen Gadol is not allowed to marry an almana. Like any Kohen, he's not allowed to marry a grusha or a chalutza. It also says that he has to marry a psula. It says, who isha bivsulaha yikach, he has to marry a psula. That eliminates any type of woman who has had any type of biyah. The Gemara will discuss particular types of biyahs, whether they invalidate her as a psula for this halacha. It also, as we shall see, may invalidate a bogeres. That is a girl who is over 12 and a half years of age. A girl has 3 stages in growth. Under 12 is considered, from 12 and under is considered to be a ketana. Over 12, but under 12 and a half is considered to be a na'ara. That is the one that a Kohen Gadol is supposed to marry. Over 12 and a half is considered to be a bogeres. She does not have full basulim any longer. She's no longer considered to be a full basula, and therefore a Kohen Gadol is not supposed to marry her. As we shall see, there's also a machlokas whether a Kohen Gadol is allowed to marry a zona, that is a woman who has had a psul of znus. Now, a regular Kohen is not allowed to marry a zona, but we shall see who the psul of zona, how that applies to a Kohen Gadol in particular. Okay, so the Gemara begins. The Gemara discusses what happens with a woman who is mikudeshes to a Kohen Gadol when she's a ketana. At the time of Kedushin, there was no problem. She was a ketana, he was a Kohen Gadol, he's allowed to marry her. Then, before they managed to do Nisuin, she became a bogeres. Now, she's too old for a Kohen Gadol to marry. He's supposed to marry someone who's not a bogeres because she's not considered to be a full psula. So one wants to know, what is the point, the focus of the halacha as to when Kohen Gadol is supposed to marry? His kedushin is supposed to be with the halachos, or his nisuin is supposed to be with the halachos? For most instances, it won't make a difference, but in this case, it does, because the kedushin was with a ketana, but the nisuin would have to be with a bogeres. So, which is the ikar point of the halachos of a Kohen Gadol? Is it the kedushin or the nisuin? So the Gemara wants to bring a proof from our last Mishnah. Our last Mishnah, we've seen a machlokes between Rabbi Meir against Rabbi Lezer and Rabbi Shimon as to whether the kedushin of a pasul to kahuna apostles a woman for kahuna, whether it makes into a chalal. There we said that everybody agrees that nisuin will definitely pasul her. Kedushin that never leads to a nisuin, kedushin that ends because the husband who did kedushin either dies or divorces her, that everybody agrees does not pasul her. So everybody agrees kedushin does not make the psul, and nisuin does make the psul. So you see that the halacha of a psul to kahuna is based on nisuin, not kedushin. So Gemara says, if we have a clear proof, then that in the case of the Kohen Gadol marrying a woman, we go by the nisuin and not by the kedushin. So Gemara says that's not a proof at all. It's not a proof at all because here we're not talking about making her into a chalala. We're not talking about which activity makes her into a chalala. Is it the kedushin of a pasul or the nisuin of a puzzle? On that, for sure, it's the biyah that's the problem. Here we're talking about what is the moment of the Kohen Gadol's isser to marry a be'ula. Is it, when it says don't marry be'ula, it says isha bivsula yikach, what's that yikach referring to? Is that referring to kedushin or nisuin? It has nothing to do with your shaila. So the Gemara wants to say, we have a proof from another Mishnah, from a brisa, that is. The brisa says that if a almana gets engaged to a Kohen, and almana is allowed to marry a regular Kohen, and while they're engaged, that Kohen becomes the Kohen Gadol. Now he's not allowed to marry an almana. So is he allowed to go ahead and marry her then? So the Brisa says yes, he's allowed to. So there you clearly see that the kedushin is the only point that's the. So this kedushin was done beheter. She was an almana to a regular Kohen at the time of kedushin. At the time of Nesuin, it'll be an almana to Kohen Gadol, but that's not where the Isser is. So therefore, you clearly see the Isser is the Kedushin, not the Nesuin. The Gemara says that's not a proof either, because over there we have a special limit from Xeris to Kasu that tells us that in this case he's allowed to marry, and that's because the Torah says Yikach Isha, who Isha bivsuleha Yikach. Why do you have to say Isha for? The extra word Isha is to be married by a certain type of woman that he is allowed to marry, even though she's not a psula, and that's if he was Mekadesh her before he became Kohen Gadol. So the Gemara says, okay, so learn this case out of Isha also. Let the word Isha also include this case where he was Mekadesh her while she was a Ketana, and then she became a Bogeres. Why can't we learn that also? So the Gemara says, because you can only learn one. It only says one word Isha. You can only learn one case out of it. So the Gemara says, well, how do you know which one to learn? The Gemara says, very simple. We're going to learn the case where her body didn't change, where she's still the same woman before she was now. This is the Isha. This is the Isha he's allowed to marry. In your case, it's a different Isha. She changed. She grew from being a Ketana to a Bogeres. That is not going to be the Isha that will be married from the extra word Isha here. Okay, this takes us to the Mishnah. The Mishnah introduces the halacha of the marriages of a Kohen Gadol, and it begins by saying that a Kohen Gadol is not allowed to marry an almana. That's a woman who was either mikudeshes or fully married with Nisuin, and then lost her husband. He's a Kohen Gadol is forbidden to marry her, whether she was just mikudeshes or even if she had Nisuin. Now, as far as Bogeres, a girl who's over 12 and a half, that's a machlokes. Tanakama, who's Rabbi Meir, says he's not allowed to marry a Bogeres, even if she's a Besula, but she's not a full Besula because the skin, the hymen, the Besulim begins to tear when she grows older, and therefore it's not fully there. She's not considered to be a full Besula once she's a Bogeres, even if she never had any Bia. Velazar and Rav Shimon say that is mutter. They are allowed to be together there. Now we have here a girsa that the Marshal adds in, which is clear that it was there in the Gemara's discussion, that a mukas eitz, that is a woman who lost her basulim through an accident, she had it ruptured by a some object, not a bia. Mukas eitz literally means struck by a branch. So if she had her hymen ruptured in some other way, so she's not a b'sula any longer, but she's also not a b'ula, so that Rav Elazar and Rav Shimon also matir, and the assumption is that Rav Elazar and Rav Shimon, according to this, girsa aser, that everybody says she would be aser in if she's a mukas eitz. We'll see that's not so agreed upon by everybody in the Gemara. All right, now our Gemara begins with the Brisa. The Brisa spells out the machlokes between Rabbi Meir and Rav Elazar and Rav Shimon about a Bogeres, and it first discusses the source of the halacha that an almana, whether it's an almana who had erisin only or an almana who also had nesuin, whether that they both are considered to be an almana and asa to a Kohen Gadol. So the more comes to Brisa and says an almana that's asa for a Kohen Gadol to marry is whether it's min erisin or min nesuin. The more quotes a pasuk that says that, and that's almana lo yikach. The Torah, who simply says almana ugrusha v'chalal zona as eila lo yikach, says the word almana that refers to all types of almana. So the Gemara says pshita. Why would you think not? The Gemara says, because you may have a potential limud which is a mistake. You may find that the word almana is written here. The word almana is also written by Tamar, Yehuda's wife. She's called in almana, shvi almana beis avich. From there, she was an almana min nesuin. So you may learn from there that almana only means almana min nesuin, not min hakadushin. So therefore, we need to have this Brisa tell me, no, even min hakadushin is called an almana. So the Gemara says, well, maybe it's taka true. Maybe it is a good limud. How do you know that it's not true? So you know it's not true because an almana has to be similar to a grusha. It says almana ugrusha v'chalala zona. So an almana has to be similar to a grusha, just like grusha is whether min nesuin or min erisin, because there's no reason to say otherwise. There is no limud there that you would potentially make to say otherwise. Therefore, you're going to say the same thing is true by a almana. It's whether it is min nesuin or min ha'erisin. The Gemara now quotes a Brisa which discusses the machlokes between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon, and the Brisa explains how they learn the pasuk, how they learn the halacha of a Bogeres. Like we said, Rabbi Meir holds that a Kohen Gadol is not allowed to marry a Bogeres because she has begun to lose her besulim. And Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon say that a Kohen Gadol is allowed to marry a Bogeres. So what's the drasha? So it's based on the word Torah uses. It says, V'hu isha bivsula ha'yikach. And he, a woman, with her besulim, he should take. Now, the bivsula ha has 3 stages there. It could have just said besula. Could have said Isha Bsula. Instead it said Bisuleha, extra yud, and then it said Bivisuleha, extra base. So there's 3 limudim there. So how do you learn these 3 limudim? What are they all for? So Rabbi Meir learns it as follows. He says if it would have just said Basula, that would have implied even a woman who's partial Basula, even a woman who's a Bulgaris, who's begun to lose her Basula. The fact that it then says Bisuleha, that adds another thing. That adds, no, partial Basulim is no good. It's got to be her full Basulim have to be there. It has to be Bisuleha, all her Basulim is. That excludes a Bulgaris. Now, once a Bulgaris is usher, there's no question about a bia shelo kedarka. That is somebody who had a bia through a rear entry, which is not there is no psulim there, but there is a loss of virginity. So there's no question that kind of bia, which counts as a bia, it is considered to be one of the mishkevei isha. So that bia, that is definitely going to passel. If a Bulgaris who lost psulim without bia is passel for a Kohen Gadol, certainly a bia shelo kedarka passels. So therefore, we have to say that the third drasha, which is bivisuleh, which is 2 basulims, beis basulim, so that's coming to include the bia shelo kedarka, to say that that's okay. Since on my own I would have said that it's aser, the limit tells me that that's okay, and a woman who had bia shelo kedarka is mutter to a Kohen Gadol. That's not a psul in her basulim. Now, Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon set it up the opposite, and they say if the Torah would have just said besula, I would have said besula refers to her complete basulim. She has to have basula. She has to be a complete basula. All her basulim have to be there. I would have excluded a Bulgaris. The fact that it says bisuleha, that teaches me that no, a Bulgaris is actually permitted. So therefore, they get their halacha that a Bulgaris is mutter to a Kohen Gadol. Only partial basulim is needed. Now, once a basula, a Bulgaris is mutter, it's quite possible that I would have thought that a shelo kedarka bia is also mutter, and therefore when the Torah says bivsuleha, that teaches me and something about shelo kedarka, that teaches me that shelo kedarka is aser. So we end up therefore, there's another machlokas here between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon. And Rabbi Meir holds that a bia shelo kedarka does not passel for kahuna gedola, but Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon hold that bia shelo kedarka does passel for kahuna gedola. Now the Gemara brings a statement of Rav on the subject, and the Gemara will try to see how it fits with the Tanaim. So the Gemara quotes over here the name of Rav, who says that a woman who has bia shelo kedarka is passel for kahuna. Seems to be saying straight up, like Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon. So the Gemara asks a kasha. The kasha is from the pasuk it's from a brisa that quotes the pasuk. It says "V'lo yisil isha." It's referring to somebody who is ma'anes a nara basula, somebody who rapes a nara, a young basula. So there, in addition to his other reparations that he owes her, he's also obligated to marry her if she wants, and he's not allowed to divorce her at any point. So the brisa says, if, however, she's apostle to him, such as if she was an almana to a Kohen Gadol, that is, the rapist was the Kohen Gadol, and she was an almana from before, or she was a grusha for chalutza from before, and the rapist was a Kohen Hedyot. Either of these situations, he does not have to marry her. That overrides the issur for him to marry her, overrides this mitzvah. So now the Gemara says, what is the case over here exactly? What happened? How are you saying that it's overridden because she's an almana or a grusha or a chalutza? How are you saying that the fact that this woman is an almana, grusha, chalutza passels the Kohen? And let's talk specifically about the Kohen Hedyot. We said that let's talk specifically about the Kohen Gadol. We said that in almana, because she was an almana from before, that's the psol. Why don't you say that there's a different psol? And that's because he was ma'anis her. She's now a be'ula. And don't tell me because he was the one who made her a be'ula. Be'ulas atzma was considered to be be'ula. The Gemara is clear about that later. That's a psul as well. So he should be, every Kohen Gadol should always be exempt from this parsha of marrying the nara that he was ma'anis, because it's always a be'ula. So it's got to be into some situation in which his be'ula, his bia, made a situation that she is he is violating the Isser Oines, and he therefore is in the parsha of the Ma'anes Amarasa, the Ma'anes Nara. However, it's not going to passel her for kahuna. And then the only way that she could be passel for kahuna would be because if she was an almana from before. So what type of bia could that be? So it must be, the Gemara says, bia shelo kedarka. That would make sense. That's the only thing we could think of. So bia shelo kedarka would be something that, therefore, or proving that a bia shelo kedarka does not passel her for kahuna, but he still then would be obligated to in velocia isha to stay married to her the rest of his life or her life, unless she's an almana. So that proves therefore that the bia shelo kedarka does not passel for kahuna. So the Gemara says that's a good proof. This brisa indeed holds that way, but this brisa is Rabbi Meir, and Rav was saying his halacha in Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar, and like Rabbi Shimon, as we said, holds that a bia shelo kedarka passels for kahuna. Rabbi Meir says that it does not, and therefore this brisa is going according to Rabbi Meir. So the Gemara says there's a different problem here, and that's if this brisa is Rabbi Elazar, then again it doesn't make sense that the brisa is saying that she's passel to kahuna because she's an almana. She's passel because she had a bia outside of wedlock, and that makes her a zona, because Rabbi Elazar holds that any bia outside of wedlock, even a panei and a pnuya, two unmarried adult individuals, that makes her a zona. A zona is passel to kahuna. Now, if a zona is passel to kahuna, it's even to a regular kohen, not only to a kohen gadol. So if Rav is saying that halacha, what case is Rav referring to? What's the case where Rav says she's puzzled to a kohen gadol because she is a be'ula shelo kedarka? She's puzzled to every kohen because any be'ula shelo kedarka is either she became a be'ula while she was married, in which case she's an almana or she's a grusha, and then Rav's not saying any halacha. Must be talking about where she's not that, and in which case then she's a zona. Because if it was outside of wedlock, so then she's also even to Kohanim Gedolim. She's also even to Kohanim Hedyotos. So what then is Rav's halacha? What's he referring to? So the Gemara wants to say maybe he's talking about where she became a be'ula by a behema. A behema doesn't count as a bia. Behema is not a human. It's not a real bia. So that makes her. So then she is a be'ula, Rav wants to say, but she's not a zona. It doesn't count as a zona. It wasn't mizana with an animal. There's no nus, but she does become. She has a halacha of a be'ula. So that's what Rav was referring to, a behema who did a be'ila shelo kedarka. So then she's a be'ula shelo kedarka. However, she's not a zona, and that's what Rav is saying, that she's also to a kohen gadol, even according to Rabbi Elazar. So the Gemara says we're not going to accept this. Either you'll define the bia of a behema as a real bia or not a real bia. If it's a real bia, so then she's a zona. That makes her into a zona as well. Zona is defined as having had a bia. Now, if it's not a bia, if a bia of an animal is not considered a bia, just considered to be a penetration by some foreign object, so then she's not a zona, but she's also not a be'ula. So you can't say that she's passel to a kohen gadol because of be'ula. So Gemara wants to say, well, maybe say that she's possible because of like mukas eitz. We said mukas eitz, any penetration by any object, anything which tears her basulim, makes her a mukas eitz, and therefore she's possible to kahanim gedolim. Maybe that's what Rav was saying. He's saying that a bia of an animal is a mukas eitz, and therefore she's a be'ula, but that's not as nus. So it says, you can't tell me that there's a din mukas eitz on a shelo kedarka, because if there's a din mukas eitz on a shelo kedarka, then every woman on the planet is a mukas eitz shelo kedarka, because every woman on the planet has placed some object in her rectal orifice when she was cleaning herself. She used a stone to clean herself after using the restroom. That's a mukas eitz shelo kedarka. So obviously you can't call mukas eitz shelo kedarka a be'ula. You wouldn't have any such situation. So the Gemara therefore wants to come up with a new thing. What happened was that she had a marriage midrabanan. She was married by her mother, by her brother, and then she did miyun. So during the time she was married midrabanan, she became a be'ula, but it's not considered to be a marriage. So she's not an almana, she's not a grusha. She's not a zona either because she didn't have a bia outside of wedlock, but she is a be'ula. And that's a situation that Rav was referring to, and he was saying that if the only bia that was done by that husband was shelo kedarka, it would have the halacha that is possible to her according to Rabbi Elazar for Kohanim Gedolim. The Gemara now gets more into the sugya of the bia of a behema and how it relates to kashrus to a kohen gadol. So the Gemara quotes Rav Simi bar Chia, who says someone who is nivala to a behema is still kasher to kahuna. Rashi understands that this means a bia shelo kedarka, because it would be a bia kedarka, she would be considered to be a mukas eitz, and she'd be possible for that reason. So there's a bia shalok kedarka of a behema doesn't count as a bia, and therefore doesn't passel her for kahuna. Whereas a Bryce seems to say this as well. Bryce says somebody that is nival to anyone who's ina ish, not human. That means a behema. So even though that person, if she did it willingly, gets skila, but if she didn't do it willingly, she is kosher to kahuna. Whereas the story when Ravdimi came, he said there was an incident that happened with a girl in a town called Hislo. She was sweeping the floor, and a large hunting dog was honest her me'achareha. Rashi understands that to mean shalok kedarka, from behind her. And Rebbe said she's kosher to kahuna, and Shmuel said she was even kosher to a kohen gadol. So Gemara says there was no kohen gadol on the day of Rebbe. Rebbe was after the destruction of the base of Mikdash. Can't be that he was matir to a kohen gadol. The Gemara says no, he just means to say that she would have been considered to be roy to a kohen gadol, even though there was not any kohen gadol at that time. Now, the Gemara says that Rava Miparzika said to Ravashi, what is the source of the halacha? There's no din of znus with a behema. Any relationship with a behema does not create the status of zona. There's no din of znus. The Gemara says it comes from the pasuk that talks about esnan zona and mechir kelav. Esnan zona is an object that's given to a zona, to a prostitute for her services, that if that was an animal that is puzzled to go on the mizbeach, can't be a carbon. Mechir kelev is something which was bought with the money that was gained from the sale of a dog, something which was swapped for a dog. Let's say you traded a dog for a sheep. You cannot use that sheep as a carbon on the mizbeach either. So the Gemara says that's only true about esnan zona and mechir kelev. If we did the opposite, esnan kelev, that is, you paid a zona to have bia with a dog with a sheep, that would be esnan kelev. Or mechir zona, if you switched a zona for a sheep, you traded. I'm not sure how that works, but so Rashi defines it. So that would be, that's not usher. That's esnan kelev and mechir zona. It's not what the Torah refers to. It only refers to esnan zona and mechir kelev. So how do you know that? So the Gemara says because it says gam shnehem, when it refers to both of them, it says you can't bring a carbon from either of them. It says shnehem, that's these two and not these four, so you can't switch it around. Therefore, you see that there is no din of zona on a kelev. There's no din of esnan kelev. Okay, now the Gemara calls the Brisa, which goes to the topic of anusas atzmai mefutas atzmai, somebody who has a forced bia with a woman, or he convinced her to do a bia with him. Does that make her considered to be a ba'ula? So if he's a kohen gadol, he requires a ba'ula. Is this still considered a ba'ula? The only bia that she had was he himself. So the more quotes the Brisa that says kohen gadol is not allowed to marry her, but if he does marry her, then the marriage is chal. He is considered to be married to her. However, if it would be anusas chaver and putas chaveri, a woman who is raped or nispate by somebody else, then he can't marry her. If he does, Rabbi Eliezer says the child is a chalal, puzzle from kuna, and the chachamim say the vlad is still kosher. Now, on the topic of if he marries her, the marriage is chal on anusas atzmai putas atzmai. So Rav Huna, the name of Rav, says he has to divorce her. The marriage is chal, but he does have to give her a get and divorce her. So the Gemara says, in what sense then do you mean to say that the marriage is chal? He's not allowed to stay married to her. What's it called chal? When it answers, Rav Acha Bar Yaakov says that there's no knas of a mufuta, that is considered to be she's considered to be his wife. Anything that happens afterwards, you can't blame him, give him the penalties that's given to a seducer, because there's no seduction there, because she is his wife. Now the Gemara says that Rav Gavia of Ksil said the sugya over in front of Rav Ashi, and he said, but Rav Yechanan and Rav have both said that a kohen gadol is not allowed to marry a bogeres or a mukas eitz, a woman who's over 12 and a half, or a woman who was penetrated by an object and doesn't have her psulim through non-miyah means. However, on that it says v'imnasa nasoi, that if he does marry her, the marriage is chal. So what you see from there is that we don't say that either of these is a problem. Because what nasi means, what if he marries her, the marriage is chal means, is that he's going to end up being married to her anyway. And is that once he's married to her, she's going to be a mukas eight, she's going to have no psulim anyway, and she's going to be a bogeres at some point anyway. So therefore there's no problem. So therefore here also, we should also say that a bias atzmai shouldn't be a problem, because she's going to be a bias atzmai anyway, and therefore there's no problem for kohen gadol to stay married to somebody like that. Different than what you said, that staying married is not something he can do. It just means that there's no din of mafuta.